The moment the quiet tutor corrected the vampire king's Latin before his entire court, the great hall fell into a silence so deep it felt like the end of the world. Cleo Thorne, a woman paid to be invisible, had just made herself the most visible person in the room. She was a scholar, not a courtier, a ghost in gray wool who haunted the edges of gilded parties. He was Lord Alaric Volkov, master of Blackwood Manor, a figure of such immense power and ancient lineage that men twice his apparent age bowed to him. His gatherings were commands, his words were law, and he had just misquoted Virgil. And she had corrected him. But what no one in that breathless, terrified room understood was that for the first time in 500 years of frozen, lonely existence, Lord Alaric was not hearing a correction. He was hearing music. If you believe that being truly seen is the most powerful magic of all, type "heard" in the comments below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Cleo Thorne was accustomed to being overlooked. It was, in a way, a condition of her employment. She was a private tutor and linguist, hired by the newly wealthy to polish their children's diction and by minor aristocrats to manage their libraries. She was plain, they said, not in a cruel way, just a statement of fact, like noting the color of a drapery. Her hair was a simple brown, her eyes a quiet gray, and she preferred the company of calfskin-bound books to that of people. Her last position had ended abruptly. Lord Ashworth, a man whose family had acquired their title only a generation ago, had dismissed her. "Your knowledge," he had said, puffing his chest out in his study, "it is unsettling for a woman to possess. My wife feels you make the other staff uncomfortable." What he meant was that she made him uncomfortable. During a dinner party, a guest had pontificated on a line from Ovid, and Cleo, who was only in the room to fetch a folio for her employer, had quietly murmured the correct attribution under her breath. The guest had overheard. Lord Ashworth had been mortified. So now she was in the service of Baron Fitzwilliam, a man with a much older name but much less coin. He was a sycophant, desperate to curry favor with the enigmatic and powerful Lord Alaric, who had recently acquired the vast neighboring estate of Blackwood Manor. Alaric was foreign, they whispered, from some cold, mountainous region of the east. He was impossibly wealthy and moved with a stillness that was unnerving. Tonight, Baron Fitzwilliam had dragged Cleo along to a grand reception at the manor. Her task was simple: wait in an alcove near the grand library, be ready to take notes should the Baron have a moment of inspiration, and otherwise cease to exist. She was perfectly content with this arrangement. The air in Blackwood Manor was heavy with the scent of beeswax, old stone, and something else. Something like pine smoke on a winter's night. A scent of the grave and the forest combined. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and candlelight. Tapestries depicting grim, ancient hunts hung on the stone walls, their threads seeming to writhe in the flickering light. Lord Alaric stood before the massive hearth, a fire roaring behind him that gave off no discernible heat. In fact, the closer one got to him, the colder the air became. He was mesmerizing. Tall and severe, dressed in immaculate black, with hair as dark as a raven's wing. He wasn't speaking to the crowd so much as holding it captive. His voice was like smoke and old wine, a low baritone that commanded attention without ever needing to be raised. He held a piece of aged parchment in his long, elegant fingers. "This document," he declared, his eyes sweeping the room, "speaks of binding oaths, of loyalty that transcends death. It quotes the poet Virgil, Audentes fortuna juvat. Fortune favors the bold." A ripple of sycophantic murmurs went through the room. Baron Fitzwilliam, standing near the front, nodded so vigorously his jowls wobbled. But in her alcove, hidden behind a marble pillar, Cleo frowned. Her heart gave a strange, painful little thump. It was wrong. The quote was famous, yes, but the context, the specific scroll he was likely referencing, it wasn't Virgil. It was a common misattribution. It was Pliny the Elder, and the full context was far grimmer. It was about facing a volcanic eruption. It wasn't about fortune favoring the bold in battle, but about a scholar's fatalistic courage in the face of nature's wrath. A scholar's courage. The scholar in her, the part of her that Lord Ashworth had tried to extinguish, rose up. It was an instinct, a compulsion for truth that was more powerful than her fear. Her voice was barely a whisper, not meant for the whole room, but in the sudden lull as Lord Alaric paused, it carried like a single clear bell. Fortes fortuna adiuvat. The correction was subtle, a change in verb from the more common iuvat to the classical adiuvat. But it was the truth of the text. Then she added, even more quietly, Pliny the Elder, not Virgil. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Every eye in the hall swiveled, first in confusion, then, as they located the source of the sound, in horror. Baron Fitzwilliam's face went from ruddy to the color of old parchment. He looked as if he was about to be sick. And then Lord Alaric's eyes found her. They were not the cold, dark gray they had appeared from a distance. In the firelight, for a fraction of a second, they burned with an impossible, internal crimson light. It was a flash so quick she might have imagined it, but the intensity of his gaze was scorching. He didn't look angry. He looked awake, as if he had been sleeping for 1,000 years and had just heard his name called. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, to pool at his feet like spilled ink, and a candle on a nearby sconce guttered and went out. Though there was no draft, he took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The crowd parted before him like water. He ignored Baron Fitzwilliam's sputtering, horrified expression. He walked directly to her alcove, stopping a few feet away. The chill that radiated from him was profound, a pocket of deep winter in the warm, crowded room. "You," he said. His voice was softer now, but it held more power than his earlier pronouncement. It was a sound meant only for her. "Repeat what you said." Cleo's throat was dry. She could feel the weight of every stare, the Baron's silent, pleading terror. But looking into Alaric's unnerving, ancient eyes, she found a strange sort of calm. This was her ground. This was language. This was truth. "The quote," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It is from Pliny the Elder's letters. He writes, Fortes fortuna adiuvat, as he resolves to sail closer to the eruption of Vesuvius. It is about the courage of knowledge, sir, not the luck of a soldier." He stared at her for a long moment, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic stillness. The crimson flickered again in his eyes, a spark of banked fire. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the petrified Baron Fitzwilliam. "This woman is in your employ?" The Baron swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. A tutor, my lord. For my daughters. A temporary arrangement. She is of no consequence, I assure you. She will be dismissed at once for her impertinence." "No!" Alaric cut him off. The word was not loud, but it cracked through the hall like a whip. "She will not." He turned back to Cleo. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "I have a library," he said, "far older and more complex than the Baron's. It requires a curator of exceptional skill, a scholar, not a note-taker." He named a sum, a yearly salary that was more than Baron Fitzwilliam saw in a decade. The Baron's jaw dropped. Gasps echoed through the assembled guests. Alaric's gaze held Cleo's. It was not a question. It was a claim. "You will begin tomorrow. A carriage will be sent for you and your belongings at dawn. You will reside here, at Blackwood." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked back toward the hearth, the crowd melting away from his path. He raised his voice once more, addressing the room, but his message was a clear dismissal. "The evening is concluded." Cleo stood frozen in her alcove, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been dismissed from her last post for being too knowledgeable, and she had just been hired for a new one, for precisely the same reason. Hired by a man whose eyes held the color of blood, whose presence froze the air, and whose shadows seemed to have a life of their own. She had been invisible her whole life, and she had just been seen, truly seen, by the most terrifying man she had ever met, the man they called the Vampire King. The carriage arrived as promised, a black lacquered coach drawn by two silent, powerful horses, as dark as midnight. The morning was cloaked in a thick fog, muffling the world and making the Baron's modest manner seem to dissolve into the gray. Cleo had only 2 small trunks, filled mostly with books. The Baron himself, pale and sweating, had carried them down the stairs, refusing to meet her eyes. He had pressed a small purse of coins into her hand, her final wages, and stammered something about wishing her well, though he looked as if he were sending her to the gallows. The journey to Blackwood was eerily quiet. The coachman, a hulking figure wrapped in a heavy greatcoat, never spoke a word. The wheels barely seemed to make a sound on the gravel drive. As they passed through the immense wrought iron gates of the estate, the fog seemed to thicken, clinging to the ancient trees that lined the path. The world outside the carriage vanished. There was only the rocking motion and the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. When they emerged from the forest, the manor loomed before her. By day, it was even more imposing. A sprawling Gothic masterpiece of dark stone, sharp gables, and countless windows that stared out like vacant eyes. It did not look like a home. It looked like a mausoleum built for a giant. A severe-looking woman in a stark black dress, the housekeeper, met her at the door. "Miss Thorne," she said, her voice as crisp and colorless as her attire. "I am Mrs. Sterling. His lordship is waiting for you in the library. Follow me." They walked through halls that echoed with their footsteps. The air was still and cold, the silence profound. There were no servants bustling about, no sounds of life. It felt as if she and the housekeeper were the only 2 living souls in the entire colossal structure. The portraits on the walls were of severe, pale-faced individuals, all bearing a striking resemblance to Lord Alaric. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. Mrs. Sterling stopped before a set of double doors carved from dark, polished oak. "His lordship is within." She did not knock, but simply opened one of the doors and stepped aside, gesturing for Cleo to enter. The room stole her breath. It was not a library. It was a cathedral of books. 2 stories high, with shelves stretching up into the vaulted, shadowed ceiling. A rolling ladder was attached to a brass rail that ran the circumference of the room. Sunlight, heavy with dust motes, streamed through a magnificent arched window at the far end, illuminating a massive desk. And everywhere, the scent of old paper, leather, and vellum. It was the most beautiful room Cleo had ever seen. Lord Alaric stood by the window, silhouetted against the light. He turned as she entered. The unnatural stillness of his movement was even more pronounced in the quiet of the library. "Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was the same low rumble she remembered, but here, in this quiet space, it seemed to resonate in the very wood of the shelves. "Welcome to Blackwood." "My lord," she managed, her voice a little small in the vastness of the room. "I trust your journey was acceptable." "It was, thank you." He gestured to the room around them. "This will be your domain. My collection is extensive. It spans many centuries and languages. Much of it is poorly catalogued. That will be your first task, to create order from this chaos." It was a scholar's dream, a lifetime of work, a haven of knowledge. But Cleo knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was not the real reason she was here. Cataloging was a task for a junior librarian. He had not offered her a fortune and a place in his fortress for that. He watched her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her polite facade to the question fluttering in her heart. "That, however," he continued, as if reading her thoughts, "is merely your public function. The reason for your salary, should anyone be so bold as to inquire." He moved from the window, gliding across the floor with no sound. He stopped before a section of shelves that seemed older than the rest. The books here were not neatly bound. They were crumbling folios, leather-wrapped codices, and scrolls sealed with wax that had long since turned brittle. "Your true purpose," he said, his voice dropping lower, "is here." He reached up and took down a heavy, leather-bound book. It was not made of paper, she realized as he laid it on a reading table. The pages were vellum, thin and yellowed with immense age. The script was Latin, but it was a strange, archaic form she had only ever seen in scholarly reproductions. "Last night," he said, his gaze intense, "you corrected me. You identified not only the error in the word, but in the attribution. You understood the context. That is a rare skill." "It is my profession, my lord," she replied quietly. "It is more than that," he countered. "It is an instinct, a feel for the dead tongue as if it were living." He gestured to the book. "I require that instinct, not just for translation, for interpretation." He opened the book. The script was dense. The ink faded to a rusty brown in places. But the words she could make out made a cold dread curl in her stomach. They spoke of sanguis et umbra, blood and shadow, of a lineage bound to skund, to the cold earth, of a stillness that was not peace but a slow, creeping petrification of the soul. "These texts," he said, his voice a near whisper, heavy with the weight of centuries, "tell the story of my family, of my condition." He did not say the word vampire, but it hung in the air between them, as sharp and clear as a shard of ice. "They speak of a curse, a progressive decay, not of the body which is preserved, but of the spirit, a descent into absolute stillness, a freezing of the heart, of all emotion, until nothing remains but cold intellect and appetite." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond power and authority in his eyes. A deep, profound weariness, a loneliness so vast it was like staring into a starless night sky. "For centuries, I have managed it. I have fought it. But the cold spreads. The stillness deepens." He gestured to the book again. "I believe the answer to halting it perhaps even reversing it, lies within these texts, but they are written in riddles, in an archaic dialect I can no longer fully command. My own understanding has been eroded by time. He was admitting a weakness, a flaw. To her, a complete stranger, it was the most shocking thing he could have possibly done. "I need you to read them," he said, "to understand them, to find the path that I have lost." He was not hiring a librarian. He was hiring a savior. He was the all-powerful Lord of Blackwood, the creature of nightmare and legend, and he was asking for her help. She looked from his haunted, ancient eyes to the impossible text on the table. This was a task that could take years. It was a task that could consume her. It was dangerous. It was mad. But it was also the first time in her life that someone had looked at her and seen not a plain, quiet woman, but a mind capable of saving them. Lord Ashworth had dismissed her for her knowledge. Lord Alaric was begging her for it. This was what it felt like to be essential. Would you have stayed, knowing the truth of his nature and the impossible task before you? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Cleo did not hesitate. She looked up from the ancient vellum, meeting his gaze directly. "When do we begin?" she asked. A flicker of surprise, faint but undeniable, crossed his features before being suppressed. He had expected fear or bargaining, or at the very least, a moment of shocked deliberation. He had not expected immediate, quiet acceptance. "Now," he said, a new resonance in his voice. And so began their routine. The days were Cleo's. She spent them in the great library, familiarizing herself with the vast collection, her hands reverently tracing the spines of books that hadn't been opened in 100 years. She began the slow, methodical work of cataloging, her neat, precise handwriting filling ledger after ledger. It was a calming, grounding task that settled the nervous energy humming beneath her skin. Mrs. Sterling would bring her meals on a silent tray, simple, nourishing food that appeared as if by magic and was cleared away just as silently. But the nights belonged to Alaric. As dusk bled across the sky, painting the library's great window in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, he would appear. He never seemed to use the door, simply materializing from the deepening shadows in a corner of the room, as if the darkness itself had given him form. They would sit at the massive oak table, a candelabrum between them casting a pool of warm, flickering light. The rest of the library would recede into a vast, whispering darkness. In these hours, the supernatural signals of his presence were undeniable. The air around the table grew cold, a stark contrast to the small flame of the candles. Sometimes, when he was focused intently on a passage, the shadows in the corners of the room would seem to stretch and stir, like slumbering beasts. The candle flames would dance and dip, as if in a strong wind, though the air was perfectly still. At first, Cleo was terrified. A deep, primal part of her screamed that she was sitting across from a predator, a wolf in the guise of a nobleman. But her scholarly focus was a shield. She would anchor herself to the text, to the puzzle of the archaic Latin, and the fear would subside into a low, constant hum. He was not an easy student. He was proud, accustomed to mastery, and his frustration at his own inability to decipher the texts was a palpable force. It would manifest as a sharpening of the cold in the air, a tightening of the shadows. "This word," he would say, his voice tight with irritation, pointing a long, pale finger at the vellum. gelu animi. It means frost of the soul. But the context is wrong. It feels incomplete. Cleo would lean closer, the scent of old parchment and the strange, cold scent of him filling her senses. The scribe uses gelu not just as frost, she would explain softly, but as a state of permanence. Not a coating of ice, but the ice itself. A soul that has become frost. It's a transformation, not a condition. He would stare at her, his crimson-flecked eyes searching her face, and the frustration would slowly recede, replaced by a grudging respect. He was testing her, she realized. But he was also learning to trust her. They were not just lessons in translation. They were lessons in intimacy. In the shared space of quiet concentration, the barriers between them began to thin. He started to ask questions that had nothing to do with Latin. "The Baron Fitzwilliam," he said one night, his eyes on the page but his attention on her. "You served him long?" "Only a few months," she replied, not looking up from her notes. "Before that, I was with Lord Ashworth, the man who found your intellect unsettling." Cleo's pen stilled. She looked up, surprised he remembered the word. "Yes, that man." "He was a fool," Alaric stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. "To possess a diamond and complain that it is not a common fieldstone." Her heart gave a strange, fluttering beat. No one had ever spoken of her mind as something precious. It had always been a tool at best, an oddity at worst. In his world of ancient power and eternal life, it was her intellect, her one true gift, that he valued above all else. The greatest revelation was not in the texts, but in him. She began to see past the vampire king, the cold lord of the manor, to the being trapped within. She saw the profound, aching loneliness of his existence. He spoke of historical events not as things he had read about, but as things he had witnessed. The Great Fire of London, the courts of the Sun King, the fall of empires. He spoke of them with a detached melancholy, the sorrow of a man who had outlived everyone and everything he had ever known. One night, they were working on a particularly difficult passage. It described a ritual, a communion of stillness that his ancestors believed would slow the curse. Alaric grew agitated. The cold in the room dropped precipitously, and frost began to form delicate, feathery patterns on the window panes. "It is a lie," he hissed, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. The wood groaned under the pressure, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "This ritual, I tried it 2 centuries ago. It accelerated the frost. It stole what little warmth I had left. The text is a trap." His control, usually so absolute, had fractured. A wave of despair and ancient rage rolled off him, so potent it made Cleo feel dizzy. The shadows behind him writhed, coalescing into a taller, darker form that loomed over his chair. Without thinking, compelled by an instinct to soothe, to anchor him, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his clenched fist. The cold was shocking. It was not the chill of a winter's day. It was an absolute, profound absence of heat. A cold so deep it felt as if it were drawing the very life from her fingertips. It was the cold of the grave. He went utterly still. The looming shadow behind him dissolved. The frost on the windows ceased its spread. His head came up, and he stared at her, his eyes wide with a raw, unguarded emotion she couldn't name. He looked at her small, warm hand covering his, a point of life against his deathly cold. "You are not afraid," he whispered. It was not a question. It was a statement of awe. "I should be," she whispered back, her voice trembling slightly. But she didn't pull her hand away. "But your frustration, it is with the text, not with me. I am not your enemy." He slowly, carefully, uncurled his fist beneath her palm, his long, cold fingers tentatively intertwined with hers. The contact was electric, a current of shocking cold and her own living warmth. It was the most intimate touch she had ever known. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not." He held her hand for a long time, the silence stretching between them, filled with unspoken things. In that moment, she understood what the true burden of being a vampire king was. It wasn't the thirst for blood or the endless nights. It was the crushing, absolute solitude. The curse wasn't just freezing his heart. It was isolating him from all living things. And she, a quiet, plain tutor, had just breached the wall of ice he had built around himself for 500 years. She had touched him, and he had let her. The balance of their arrangement had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer just a master and his scholar. They were something more. This newfound intimacy, however, did not go unnoticed. While Blackwood Manor was a world unto itself, it was not entirely cut off. Alaric had a court, of a kind. Other ancient beings who owed him fealty, and powerful humans who were bound to him by pacts of secrecy and mutual benefit. Among them was a man named Casimir. He was another vampire, though not nearly as old or powerful as Alaric. He was ambitious, cruel, and resentful of Alaric's dominion. He saw the Lord of Blackwood's growing preoccupation with the human tutor as a sign of weakness, an uncharacteristic lapse in judgment, a vulnerability to be exploited. Cleo became aware of his existence through whispers and shadows. Sometimes, when walking in the manor's sprawling, overgrown gardens, she would feel a pair of eyes on her. She would turn and see nothing but the rustle of leaves, a shadow that seemed to move too quickly. Mrs. Sterling's warnings became more pointed. "You are not to walk in the west garden after sunset, Miss Thorne," the housekeeper had said one afternoon, her voice tight. "It is not safe." Cleo, emboldened by her new standing with Alaric, had simply nodded, but she felt the prickle of danger. It was a different feeling from the awe-inspiring power that radiated from Alaric. This was something sly and predatory. The attack came on a moonless night. Alaric had been called away on some urgent business, a rare occurrence. He had left Blackwood just after dusk, promising to return before dawn. "Stay within the library," he had commanded, his eyes dark with a concern he tried to mask. "Bolt the doors. Do not leave until I return." Cleo had agreed. But after hours spent poring over the texts, the air in the library felt stifling. She had found something, a potential breakthrough, a reference to a counter-ritual that required a specific celestial alignment, and an herb, starlight bloom, that was said to only grow in moonlight on consecrated ground. She needed fresh air to clear her head. The main gardens at the front of the manor were always bathed in the light from the house. Surely, a few moments there would be safe. She unbolted the heavy library doors and slipped out into the main hall, then through the grand entrance. The night was cool and silent. The air smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. She walked down the stone steps and onto the gravel path, wrapping her arms around herself. The peace was shattered in an instant. A figure detached itself from the deep shadow of a yew hedge. It was a man, handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, with pale hair that gleamed in the faint starlight. It was Casimir. "The little scholar," he purred, his voice a silken menace. "So brave to venture out alone. Does your master know you've slipped your leash?" Cleo's blood ran cold. She took a step back toward the house. "I don't know who you are." "Oh, I think you do," he said, taking a fluid, silent step toward her. He moved with a vampire's grace, but it lacked Alaric's weighty stillness. It was the movement of a viper. "I am Casimir, and I am tired of watching our king go soft over a mortal pet. He has grown careless, distracted." Before she could scream, he was on her. He moved with inhuman speed, a blur of motion. One hand clamped over her mouth, the other wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. His strength was terrifying. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "He will pay a high price for you," Casimir whispered in her ear, his breath cold against her skin. "And I will be the one to collect." He began to drag her toward the darkness of the trees, away from the manor. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but it was like fighting against a statue of iron. And then the world exploded into chaos. A roar of pure, animalistic fury ripped through the night, a sound that seemed to come from the very stones of Blackwood Manor itself. It was not a human sound. It was the rage of a predator whose territory had been invaded, whose mate was threatened. The shadows around them erupted. They were no longer passive pools of darkness. They became solid, tangible things. Tendrils of pure night shot out from the base of the manor, from beneath the trees, converging on Casimir with silent, terrifying speed. Alaric appeared at the top of the steps. He was no longer the composed, aristocratic lord. This was a primal force of nature. His eyes were not flecked with crimson. They were solid, burning coals of fury. His fangs were descended, long and sharp, gleaming in the faint light. The shadows were an extension of his will, a writhing, living weapon. Casimir, for all his arrogance, was terrified. He shoved Cleo away from him, causing her to stumble and fall hard on the gravel path. He tried to flee, but the shadows were too fast. They wrapped around his ankles, his wrists, his throat, pulling him down, smothering him. Alaric was before him in the space of a heartbeat, his movement too fast for the human eye to track. He lifted Casimir by the throat with one hand, his fingers sinking into the other vampire's flesh. "You dared!" Alaric snarled, his voice a low, guttural thunder. "You dared to touch what is mine, in my own home." Casimir choked, his face a mask of terror. "She is a weakness, a mortal plaything. I was showing you—" "You were showing me your own ambition," Alaric cut him off, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And now I will show you the consequences." Cleo, watching from the ground, her body trembling, expected a swift, violent end. But what happened next was worse. Alaric did not kill him. He held Casimir immobile with his shadows and his own immense strength. And he spoke in the ancient, guttural language of the texts, a language of power and binding. Light, pale and sick, flared around Casimir. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. When the light faded, he collapsed. He was not dead, but he was diminished. The power, the arrogance, the very vampiric nature seemed to have been stripped from him, leaving a pale, trembling husk of a man. Alaric let him drop to the ground. "Crawl away from here," he commanded, his voice vibrating with contempt. "You are exiled. If you ever set foot on my lands again, your existence will be forfeit." The broken thing that was once Casimir scrambled away into the darkness, weeping. The shadows receded. The fury in Alaric's eyes banked, the crimson fading back to a flicker. The predator vanished, and the Lord returned, though his stillness was now laced with a trembling rage. He turned to Cleo, who was still on the ground, her knee scraped and bleeding from the fall. In an instant, he was kneeling before her, his expression one of anguish. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice raw. "I'm all right," she breathed, though she was shaking uncontrollably. "Just frightened." His eyes fell on the scrape on her knee, where a trickle of blood welled up, bright against her pale skin. His pupils dilated. A flicker of the predator returned, a primal focus on the wound. He visibly fought it, his jaw clenching. But Cleo wasn't afraid of that look. Not anymore. She had just seen what he was capable of when he was truly angry. She had seen him command the very night itself to protect her. "Alaric," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was the first time she had used his name. His head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. "I am not a fragile thing to be locked away," she told him, her own strength returning. "Casimir was wrong. I am not your weakness. My knowledge, the knowledge you value, is our strength. We fight this together, not with you hiding me away." He stared at her, at the fierce determination in her quiet gray eyes, at the smear of dirt on her cheek and the blood on her knee. He had seen her as a scholar, a curiosity, a key to his salvation. He had begun to see her as something precious to be treasured. But now, for the first time, he saw her as a partner, an equal, a queen to stand beside him, not a princess to be hidden in a tower. He reached out, his hand hovering over her bleeding knee. The hunger in his eyes was still there, a constant battle, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning protectiveness. "Together," he agreed, his voice thick with an emotion that was centuries old and yet entirely new. And as he helped her to her feet, the cold that always surrounded him seemed, for just a moment, to lessen, chased away by the fierce, unyielding warmth of her courage. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic at Blackwood Manor solidified. Cleo was no longer just the librarian. She was the lady of the house, her quiet authority accepted without question by Mrs. Sterling and the unseen staff. Her place was at Alaric's side, not just in the library at night, but in all his affairs. The breakthrough she had made on the night of the attack proved to be the key. The starlight bloom was not just an herb, it was a metaphor. The texts described it as a flower born of earthly grace under celestial fire. Cleo, cross-referencing the poetic description with ancient astronomical charts and geological surveys of the estate, made a stunning discovery. The herb was a rare, phosphorescent moss that grew only in a specific cave system beneath the manor, and only when a particular comet, one that passed every 76 years, was visible in the sky. That comet was due in a matter of days. The counter-ritual was not about reversing the curse entirely, but about reintroducing a seed of warmth to the frozen soul, a focal point of mortal connection that would halt the spread of the Gelu enemy. The ritual required two people, one of the bloodline and one who was the anchor of grace. It was a partnership. To celebrate, and to formally announce Cleo's new position to the wider world, Alaric decided to host another grand reception. The guest list was nearly identical to the one from that first, fateful night. Baron Fitzwilliam was invited. Lord Ashworth, who had recently become a neighbor of the Baron's and was desperate for an invitation, was also on the list. Cleo stood beside Alaric at the top of the grand staircase, greeting the guests, She was not in her customary gray wool. Alaric had commissioned a gown for her, a magnificent creation of deep midnight silk that shimmered with threads of silver echoing the night sky. Her hair was elegantly styled, and around her throat lay a simple, beautiful necklace of dark gems that Alaric had called nightfall stones. She was no longer plain. She was transformed. The quiet confidence she had found in the library now radiated from her. She was not just beautiful, she was powerful. When Baron Fitzwilliam approached, he bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. He did not dare meet her eyes. "Miss Thorne, my lady," he stammered. "You are radiant." "Baron," she said, her voice calm and even. There was no triumph in it, only a quiet certainty. "I am pleased you could attend." A short while later, Lord Ashworth came through the line. He stopped dead when he saw her. His jaw went slack, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, horrified recognition. This regal, stunning woman was the same quiet, unsettling tutor he had dismissed for being too smart. "Thorne," he breathed, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. Alaric's hand rested lightly on the small of Cleo's back. The temperature around them dropped by several degrees. His voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling weight of his authority. "You will address her as Lady Cleo," he said. "The mistress of Blackwood Manor." Ashworth paled, stammering an apology before scurrying away into the crowd, his social ambitions for the evening utterly ruined. In that moment, in front of the very man who had wounded her, who had cast her out for the quality Alaric cherished most, her old life was left behind forever. She was no longer the overlooked tutor. She was the woman who had captured the heart of the vampire king. Later that evening, Alaric stood before the great hearth, just as he had done on that first night. But this time Cleo was at his side, her hand linked with his. "Many of you were here," Alaric began, his voice resonating through the suddenly silent hall, "when I first had the honor of meeting Lady Cleo. She possessed a knowledge that humbled me, a clarity that I had not encountered in centuries." He looked down at her, his eyes dark and full of an ancient, rediscovered warmth meeting hers. "She came here as a scholar, to bring order to my history, but she has done more. She has brought light to my future." He raised their joined hands. "Let it be known that Cleo Thorne is the lady of this house. Her word is my word. Her safety is my own. She is the anchor of my soul and the mistress of my heart." It was a declaration, a formalization of their bond, made before the very society that had once dismissed her. The vampire king would not be denied, and he had chosen his queen. The reception ended, the guests departed, and a profound quiet fell over Blackwood Manor. 2 nights later, under the light of the passing comet that streaked like a silver scar across the heavens, they descended into the caves beneath the house. They found the phosphorescent moss, glowing with a soft, ethereal blue light. The ritual was simple, quiet. It was not about chanting or sacrifice. It was about connection. Holding the glowing moss, with Alaric's cold hand in hers, Cleo simply focused on her feelings for him, her respect for his ancient mind, her compassion for his loneliness, her burgeoning love for the man beneath the monster. She poured all the warmth of her living, mortal heart toward his ancient, frozen one. A faint golden light emanated from her, flowing down her arm and into him. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and for the first time in 500 years, Alaric Volkov felt a flicker of genuine warmth spread from the center of his chest. It was not a cure. The curse was not broken. but it was halted. The frost had met its match. Time passed. A year. The library was fully catalogued, a monument to her diligence. But her work was not done. It had simply changed. The nights were still for reading, but now they read poetry, history, philosophy, sharing the world through books. The cold still clung to him, a permanent part of his nature, but it no longer felt like the grave. It felt like him. One evening, they sat by the fire in the library. A real fire, one that gave off real heat. He could tolerate it now, in small doses, when she was near. She was reading aloud from a book of mortal poetry about the changing seasons. He reached out and gently took the book from her, marking her place. "Cleo," he said, his voice soft. He took her hand. It was still so much warmer than his. "Your seasons change. Mine do not. A year to you is a lifetime of memories. To me, it is a breath." She knew what he was asking. The question of her mortality had always been there, a silent guest in the room. "I will not lose you," he said, his voice raw. "I will not endure that again. But I will not command you. The choice must be yours." He was offering her eternity, an endless succession of nights at his side. He was offering her the bite, the transformation, the sharing of his curse and his immortality. She looked at him, at this ancient, powerful being who had been brought back from the brink of emotional extinction by a quiet woman with a love for dead languages. She saw the love in his eyes, a love as vast and deep as time itself. She smiled, a small, soft smile. She raised his cold hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles. Then she gently tilted her head to the side, exposing the pale, vulnerable skin of her neck. Her answer needed no words at all. For more stories where quiet strength conquers ancient sorrow, and where being overlooked becomes the source of ultimate power, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.